Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Coffee and Geography. Now, let's introduce this person immediately because he's been on the podcast before and he's been one of my co-hosts. Geography head of department, GIS advocate, SharedEd, just champion. All things GIS. But out of all of that, the most important descriptor for this person is one of my bestest friends in the world, and that's Mr. Alistair Hamill. It's good to see you.
It is absolutely wonderful to be back on. Great to catch up as ever, and I'm very excited about the story that we're going to try and tell today.
Yeah, and the thing is, folks, so I'm kind of like breaking from regular format, and if you like, so we know that this season is all about climate ambassadors, the climate ambassador scheme, and things like that. Now, unfortunately, the climate ambassador scheme, as it is designed at the moment, doesn't cover the other nations of the United Kingdom outside of England. It is purely an England thing, a Department for Education focused on England. Scotland do have their own things, Wales do have their own things, Northern Ireland have their own things. But in my heart of hearts, and with the work that Alistair does, you're climate ambassador in all but name, to be honest, Alistair. So, and I think some of the stuff that we're going to talk about today is hugely relevant to the work that climate ambassadors are doing in England and the work that schools are trying to achieve here through the climate ambassador scheme. So that's why, folks, we're kind of breaking usual programming. So rather than having a climate ambassador on as I normally do, my good friend Alistair has got such a fantastic thing to share with you all, and I just couldn't say no, because why would I wait until next year to have this on? So Alistair, take it away. Where should we start? I mean, we don't need to do the brews and all that kind of stuff. We've done all that. Go and listen to Alistair's Coffee and Geography podcast episode proper. I'll put a link in the description. So
the brew is still going strong. I don't know if you can see that. A mug that one of my students gave me. Warning, may start talking about geography. One of my students gave me that. They said to him that the problem is not getting me started; it's getting me stopped. But we've got a hard cut-off because we're coming to you live from the chalk face or interactive whiteboard face as it is now. I am sitting in my classroom in Lurgan College in County Armagh, and that's why it's probably going to sound a little bit echoey in here, and you might hear a few rattles and bells and whistles in the background. So I'm coming for where the magic happens to tell something this story, and I'm really excited to be able to kind of jump in and shoehorn into the stuff for the climate ambassadors. When I heard of what you were doing, one of the first questions you'll remember I asked is, can people from Northern Ireland do it? Not yet, but one of the great things I think about being part of the United Kingdom with the 4 different nations and the different approaches that we take is that there's a chance to learn from each other and to have that diversity that we can listen to and engage with. So what you're hopefully going to get a little bit of an insight into a particular project that we're doing here in Northern Ireland. But I thought the place to start, and you are absolutely the expert in this, Kit, because you were the first person I ever heard talk about teaching climate change as a safeguarding issue. And I remember vividly coming across that concept as you were articulating it and just being really struck by the framing of that, of making me think about this differently. As an educator, I think very often we're thinking about the knowledge that we're having to communicate to our young people, and certainly there's a lot of knowledge that the young people need to learn about climate change. But the social and emotional dimensions of learning are so key. You've got to try and get the kids to care about the stuff that you're doing. I've a collection of rocks in my classroom right now that there's one rule when they come in, everybody has to get excited about rocks, and I do my best, and you know what, it pretty much always works, to get really excited and emotionally engaged with the whole thing. So it's such an important dimension to it. And it was really, I think, for you when I heard from you to first flag it up, to really get me to think, I need to be considering that as I educate. So this is partly me trying to grapple with that as we tell the story this afternoon. But I would love actually to hear from you, first of all, a little bit as to your journey into all of that and some of your experiences and why you think that's important.
Yeah. So folks listening, you probably heard of me mention this before about how I say, but yeah, you're right, Alistair. I don't think on the podcast I've actually gone into too much detail about kind of like the origin of all that and kind of like how and why I feel so passionate about that. So For me, it's a case of when I was a high school teacher myself, and if you're a teacher, folks, you know for a fact that safeguarding is a number one priority. You've got to do your safeguarding training. It's a statutory thing. It's a responsibility for the whole school community. And I found myself increasingly I mean, I've got a background in climate science, and of course, so as I'm teaching through high school, I'm always reading up about climate change, the latest climate change data and the studies. So the birth and the development and the rapid progression of extreme weather event attribution studies, stuff like that, where we can actually now start to say whether an individual event is down to human climate change, or its severity or its frequency could be down to human climate change. And so me with my geographer's hat on, I'm sitting there thinking, as I'm doing my safeguarding training, really, update at school, I'm thinking, how are we not treating climate change as a safeguarding issue? Because, I mean, you can follow me with this, Alistair, and probably people listening who teach geography. When I was in school, it was climate change, could be this bad. There are some issues possibly in far off lands, the Maldives may disappear, the increase in flooding in Bangladesh, and all this kind of stuff. But it was always a problem that might be happening in the future of far off lands. And it's increasingly becoming a case where we actually have the evidence, the scientific evidence through these attribution studies that it is happening here in the United Kingdom, and people, especially the most vulnerable, and we include students in that because safeguarding usually, it involves our most vulnerable young people. Well, of course it does. So then when you put two and two together, you're thinking, hang on a minute, it really is a safeguarding. So there's three components for me. Component number one is that we have the sociology and psychology experts research that say climate anxiety and eco-anxiety is real, it's a thing, and young people are suffering from it. And I know that some of your youngsters have talked about that. Number two is that we have increased attribution studies that say increasingly the things that we have been directly impacted with, heat events, flooding events, drought events, stuff like that, are having a direct impact with people that our communities and the schools and the kids that we teach. And then so number three, and this was it for me, Alistair, and everybody, linked to statutory safeguarding policy here in England, there's a line in the mental health guidance for schools document, and you've got a table. And on one side it says risk factors to children's mental health and protective factors for factors of mental health. And in the risk factors, there's a bullet point that says disasters, war, or other overwhelming events. And I'm thinking, perhaps with the exception of war, although that could be a secondary impact from climate change, I'm thinking you could take that bullet point out and replace it with climate change, and it would still mean the same thing. Yeah. So that was my link into safeguarding. And since then, I've done loads of other things. So that's my origin story for it, really. And I've been pushing that boat ever since.
Brilliant. And it's funny because, I mean, I've heard you talk about that many times. I don't think I've ever heard the origin story myself. It's fascinating. Just as you're talking there, the attribution studies, I think that's a really powerful dimension to try and educate the knowledge dimension of climate change to our young people. I do a case study with my sixth formers on river flooding, and I chose to do the dreadful flooding that took place in Derna in Libya in 2022. Yeah. So Wadi Derna, which basically catastrophically gave way after Storm Daniel dumped 18 months of rain in a couple of days. And the way it was described is almost like this is a tsunami in reverse. This wall of water came from inland and washed thousands of people out to sea. We will never know how many people died there. And the attribution studies that came in linked that very, very directly to climate change and talked about how much more likely those events are in a warmer world. I introduce that to my students when I'm teaching this, and I'm saying to them again, as you're saying, that climate change is less about the impacts in the future, the impacts now. And this is how science is backing that up. But even as I'm doing that, I'm aware of the fact that, and I'm sure it's the same with schools that you're associated with, that my classes are very multicultural. I will in almost every class have either young people that have migrated over or children of migrants, mostly from Eastern Europe, but increasingly from all over the world. So I'm aware of the fact that whenever I'm telling stories about events that are happening over the world, I am telling stories about countries where those young people may not be experiencing it in Lurgan, County Armagh in Northern Ireland, but their family back home is. So this year when I was teaching that case to the sixth form, it's some Polish pupils in the class. And they were talking, of course, you'll remember in summer of 2024, the catastrophic heat in Eastern Europe, followed by the huge floods that happened. And to tap into their stories of their families and their friends back home of what was happening then. And I'm just so caught when I'm looking at this again of the fact that even if we personally are not in our particular schools or context in the UK feeling these big headline stories yet, the chances are there are children and young people in our classes whose families, whose friends are living in countries that are. And for us to teach that as safeguarding is so vital.
Well, yeah, it's so just to kind of go on to what you just said there, and that's the thing, because one of the things it quite clearly states in safeguarding is I mean, there's very little a school can do in terms of which we call contextual safeguard, the things that are outside of our control, but we must be aware of. And so this is one of these examples that's contextual safeguarding, is that when you've got relatives, family members who you're exceptionally close to, who are having these impacts, and that is a change in circumstance that could cause family trauma, that can cause all these things, which could be when you're sitting in the classroom and you've got all of those red flags that we've all been taught about, we've all been trained about, sudden behaviour changes, self-harming, all these kind of things. We're increasingly becoming now where it may not necessarily, I mean, we're not meant to make judgments when we do a safeguarding flag, of course we don't, but it is important for us to know, especially the safeguarding leads, that not only could be a sign of domestic abuse, not only could it be a sign of these things that must be flagged up, but increasingly it could be a sign of these impacts from climate change. That sudden behavioural change in that young person, they've lost a very a really, really close family member because of these things. Their whole community back home or where they've come from has been destroyed, and that's leading to these, they're not eating properly, they're self-harming, etc., stuff like that. And the fact that that's not yet in safeguarding policy or not yet being part of safeguarding training is, for me, as someone who looks at all of this stuff and the data, is beggars belief, really.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it's in that context then that I'm trying to grapple with as a geography teacher. How do I communicate the urgency, which is absolutely necessary because education is empowering? Of course, they need to know. How do I do that without amplifying that? Whether the young people themselves are having what you've alluded to, specific personal experiences of it, and there will be, or whether it's the young people sitting there just as citizens of the 21st century world who are very informed and aware of what's going on. How do I do that without feeding into and amplifying the anxiety? And I took a look at SDG 13, climate change, climate action. The language in it is very much focused on communicating the urgency. So I'm just looking at the side screen here to read some of them out. Some of the keywords: every person, cataclysm looming, underprepared, threatens life, devastating, instability in wars, drastically off track, catastrophic consequences. I took those phrases and put them into an AI image generator to see what it would generate. And my goodness, the images are powerful. And it's an interesting little thing, a slight sidebar here of how you can use AI to help you kind of think and assess about what are the messages I'm communicating, maybe inadvertently. All of those statements are true. Climate action is absolutely required, absolutely immediately. But if we communicate to young people using those words alone, what are we doing? And it was in that context of how do we balance those two things, because you've got two conflicting challenges here of we need to communicate the urgency, but as we communicate the urgency, what a teen seems to do is to weigh down the anxiety. how do we balance that? And it was in this particular context that I came up with this little idea. And the idea is to introduce a third concept. We've got urgency, we've got anxiety, and the third concept is agency.
Yes.
And I'm going to define agency at this offset, and then we'll take the story forward. The agency, as I'm defining it, is the ability of a person to make choices and take actions that shape their own lives and environment. It involves a sense of control, autonomy, and the belief that one's decisions can have an impact on one's circumstances. And it was in that context that I came across an academic paper that I've been telling you about, that I would highly recommend. It's freely available and it's not behind a paywall, by Greer and Glacken. It's called What Counts as Education, or What Counts as Climate Change Education Perspectives from Policy Influencers. Very, very interesting paper. But it came up with a framework for me that was the catalyst as I tried to plan for this kit moving forward. So I want you to imagine 3 circles. So you've got one down towards the bottom, and then a bigger one growing up above it, and a third one growing up above that again. So if you can picture that in your mind, those 3 spheres that they talked about. So the one down at the bottom, the smallest one, was climate change education for knowledge. Oh, brilliant. There you go.
So for people watching us, they can see it on the screen, but keep describing it for people listening. Yep.
So climate change education for knowledge. And I think that probably as educators, that's the one that is a no-brainer to us, right? Of course, I'm teaching a GCSE specification, climate change is on it. Of course, I'm going to teach them knowledge about it. But what I loved about this was how it then went out into 2 more spheres. So the second one out is climate change education for capabilities. And in the paper, they talk about in this as enabling young people to be agents for change in a climate change world. So there's the agency in there, the capabilities, and the geographers here will, I'm sure, be familiar with some of the work in the geography community and geo capabilities, and in terms of what this knowledge that we're teaching is enabling in terms of action and agency. So what are we going to do now? I thought that's a really nice next step, but then my internal critic said, okay, I'm not a cynic by nature, Kit. I'm an optimist, but I turned on the inner critic at least for a while, and I said, right, let's take the worst version of this. Right, young people, there's disaster looming. We've got to do it. Look at SDG 13. So here's what I'd like you to do. You're an intelligent 16-year-old. You're understanding the complexities of the politics and the geopolitics of the world and the scale of all of these things. The challenge is there. So this is what I want you to do. Go and recycle your plastic bottles, please.
Yeah.
Right. That's important. Personal responsibility matters. But an intelligent 16-year-old who is geopolitically aware goes, really? That's going to solve all of these things that SDG 13 is talking about? So it made me think, well, there's agency and there's actions that they can do, but not all actions are created equal. And that's where the third sphere from this paper is so powerful as well. It's called expansive climate change education, and they interpret it like this in the paper. This is positioning education as integral to society's response to climate change right now. It's making the young people citizens right now. Schools teach citizenship. Again, citizenship is often taught in a very theoretical way. This is in theory what it means to be a citizen. Why don't we put this into action? So put all of that together, right? We do need to know something about climate change. They do need to understand earth science and earth systems. Do need to understand the human systems that interact with that and produce the outcomes we've got. Next bit, I need them to respond to that by making them, or giving them a sense of agency. But the third sphere, that agency has got to connect somehow to making them citizens so that the scale of their response is enough to make them feel like my response is making a difference. I'm not just doing something, I'm making a difference. And I would say that paper, hopefully maybe at some stage Greer and Glacken will get to watch or listen to this, because absolute shout out to them. It was the catalyst that inspired that idea. Yeah. And it's just, I would say to those that are listening in, sometimes those academic papers can feel a little bit dense and a little bit obscure. You never know what ideas will be sparked just by jumping in. And that really was, I suppose, the catalyst for moving on to the next stage of the story. So if that's where my thinking was, where did we go next?
Yeah. Well, the paper is... folks, I would strongly recommend you definitely give that Greer and Craigavon paper a read. It is not that long. It is actually not that long. If you don't count the references section, it is only 6 pages long, and actually it's one of those ones which is not like your classic black and white paper. It's actually got a bit of colour to it as well. So good news. And those you were watching, you saw the little the diagram there. So this then leads to what you enthusiastically text me about. You said, Kit, I really want to talk about this, and I'm just like, because you know you were speaking straight to my heart, because you know I'm someone who's like student voice, student action, student leadership, and you know, like, I'm a big fan of the SharedEd stuff, which people, again, please, after you've listened to this, go and listen to Alistair's first chat with me, because the SharedEd stuff is inspirational. And now this is almost like, I wouldn't say it's like the next chapter. It's like you've got this fantastic thing that you've set up through SharedEd, and you're like, right, now how can we now bring this issue of climate change into this, and because this is what the kids want. This is what we can all collaborate and bond over almost. So I'm really excited to hear about this, and I'm really excited for everyone to hear about this.
Okay, so yeah, good, because this is the first time in a podcast context I've had a chance to tell this story, so I'm excited too. Okay, so just a little bit of brief context for listeners who don't know what SharedEd means. In Northern Ireland, it has a particular context. If you know anything about Northern Ireland, you'll know the tragic, violent division that we had in the past. We have lived now almost as many years post-conflict as we did during conflict. We've been on a major journey, and the previous podcast tells a lot about that, but we're still on the journey 25 years later, 28 years later, whatever it is. We are still living in largely separate areas in towns and cities, and the young people generally go to separate schools. So into that context comes shared education, which the name is quite simple. It is pretty much what it says. We're sharing our educational experiences together. I've led SharedEd now in Lurgan for close to 20 years and had all sorts of wonderful adventures. And what it really does is allows us to bridge that Protestant Catholic divide, bring the young people together, and every young person that comes through that experience breaks down the stereotypes that exist there, and have a wonderful experience of that. But particularly in this context, we were reflecting in a conversation with a friend of mine who's very much into environmental action on the particular perspective of Northern Ireland, because here we are 25 years in the peace process, 25 years from what appeared to be an intractable and unsolvable violent conflict. And what we've demonstrated here to the young people is that if we put our minds to it, if we decide that we want to take the kinds of bold and brave decisions for peace, we can go on a journey. The past doesn't necessarily inevitably determine the future. We can write the future with the choices we make. 25 years in, we're on a journey, still a place to go, but we have made incredible progress. And we're now just about 25 years to the big 2050 net zero, to less than, no, it is 25 years, isn't it?
Wow, parallels.
Exactly. You can see where we're going.
Yeah, right? Yeah.
So this was an attempt really for us to say, right, well, if Northern Ireland, if we can demonstrate with our 1.8 million people the journey in the peace process and the risks for peace and how we've done that, can we be an exemplar, shining light to the world of how we can take bold actions for climate change in a 25-year period? And when you frame it like that, I just thought that really excites me. What a tremendous vision, particularly for Northern Ireland. So what I decided to do, because I had to try and get this to be something at that level where it felt like the young people were genuinely doing something that would make a difference. Of course, as you know, as you've already said, I'm a big GIS fan. So I started to explore a little bit of the urban heat island effect, and particularly the role of trees in adaptation to urban heat island. Now, for those that aren't massively into geography. The essence of the urban heat island is that because of the building materials that you get in urban areas, they tend to absorb more heat during the day and retain that and re-rate it at night. So urban areas tend to be warmer than the surrounding rural areas. Now, you factor in climate change and rising temperatures, and you're amplifying the urban heat island. And we're getting to the point where, tragically, every summer when you get these high temperatures, there are multiple thousands of excess deaths that are attributed to that excess heat. And in that context, the way that we adapt to that is through urban planting and the trees that we've got. So I thought to myself, wouldn't it be brilliant to try and set up a citizen science project involving the young people from SharedEd partnership here to basically get them to use Survey 123, which is a GIS survey app that you can use on your phone. It uses your phone's GPS to geotag the data that you collect, and they would simply go out and they would collect the data on the nature and the quality of the trees in the very streets where they lived. Now, because of the fact that we were doing this with secondary age pupils, so slightly older, and because of the fact that we're just doing it in the streets outside, all of a sudden we overcame this challenge that geography teachers have with field work of how we're going to get the time to do this, how we're going to get the supervision ratios to do this. Contacted the parents, of course, just to get permission that was all okay. And we were able to, now we did our own school, Learning College in St. Ronan's, and 2 other schools in the local area. 2 other geography departments were very keen. We ended up with around about 400 or 500 young people going into the streets of Lurgan and the surrounding areas collecting data. The scale of this was crazy. Even being involved in something of that scale, saying to the young people, you know, this is so much more than just you recycling your personal bottle. You're part of something that's hundreds of teenagers in your town. And of course, then it being the GIS data, it was immediately mapped. So we were looking at things like the height of the tree, the circumference of it, the radius of the canopy, the circumference of the trunk at chest height, which allows you to work out a lot of other calculations about the amount of CO2 the tree would absorb, where the tree is growing. Is it growing out of like a concreted area? Is it in a parked area? A really, really rich and nuanced project. And part of the brilliant thing in that, because I was starting to put that together last June 2024. And so some of my students had come back after their exams. It was lovely sunny weather. They'd worked very, very hard. So I said, right, we're going to take a few lessons for you just to help test this out, pilot this with me. I want you to help me to kind of figure out, thank you, you got some of the images of the young people there on the screen for those listening in audio. So we took them out. So the young people really were helping me to solve the problems. I said to them, I don't want to micromanage this. I want you to have this sense of agency. So I said, like, we can estimate the height, but we tried that visually, and a whole bunch of them, well, we got all sorts of varying approaches. How are we going to quantify that? So one of my year 11 pupils said, Mr. Hamill, should we use the measure tool on the iPhone? I said, well, great. I'm not a teenager, so I don't have an iPhone. So tell me what the measure tool is. And he showed me. And all of a sudden, there was his idea. Tom. So shout out to Tom. His idea to use the measure tool. In fact, if you're watching the video, that's Tom on the left, photograph doing just that. So him having that input into the whole thing, helping me to design it, giving him a sense of agency. Then the second thing, because this was going to be young people doing surveys without a teacher supervising, we had to make sure that the data we would get would be as reliable as possible. So how do you make this simple for kind of like a 13-year-old, a 15-year-old, 17-year-old to do without teacher supervision? So how do we measure the circumference of the tree at chest height? I couldn't send them out with tape measures. So if you're looking at the video, you already know the answer to this. Again, the pupils came up with this answer. One of them said, well, we've got the measure tool on the iPhone. Why don't we measure what they call our wingspan? So they just simply put their arms out, outstretched side by side, measured using the measure tool, their wingspan, and then get this, Kit, they went and they hugged the tree.
Hugged trees. Yes.
Now, here's why I love that, because that's every stereotype about like the tree hugger, right? So let's, in terms, sometimes whenever things are thrown at you as an insult, the best thing to do is to reclaim that insult.
100%.
Right? You call me a tree hugger? Absolutely, I'm a tree hugger. Watch me hug the trees, and watch what I'm doing with this and the data that I'm collecting. And then, of course, there's a whole bunch of other research that indicates the power of physical touch and connection, of outside learning, of actually just touching these things that are trees, parts of the environment that all too often we walk past. We're pausing and we're noticing, very mindful, very much taking the time to really connect in a literal sense. And I love the fact that once we'd finished the pilot survey and we sent all of those students out, in my mind, this is how the story went. Randomly, all around the town of Lurgan over the next couple of weeks, people would be driving down the roads to see a bunch of teenagers just randomly standing in the street hugging a tree. They wouldn't have been wearing a school uniform at that stage. So, like, why have the teenagers of Lurgan all of a sudden started hugging trees? In my mind, that's the story I want to tell. Because in my mind, that's the story of like the example that those young people can be of that connection. So we ended up, I think we have about 700 unique data points on the GIS
amazing.
map.
Yeah.
Where each one of them full of really powerful and insightful pieces of information. The photographs of the trees are in there as well. And of course, with the GIS map, the young people are able to go in and interrogate and start some of the patterns. And one of the things that I wanted to do, we set up then from September a little steering group, which meets once a week on a Wednesday afternoon, the SharedEd group. So students from my school and from St. Ronan's are really the ones that are taking these data and very much finding the story that's contained within them. And one of the dimensions that we wanted to look at there was the social justice issue. Because again, one of the key things you're communicating about climate change is that those that are least responsible for causing it are often those that are most impacted by it.
Yeah.
And you see that very much in our urban areas. I mean, there's a reason why the leafy suburbs are called the leafy suburbs. And you go from there to some of the more kind of working class areas, and all of a sudden you have very, very few street trees in comparison. So there's a massive social justice dimension. So what the young people started to do here was to take a look at the areas that they knew and looking at the difference of the distribution of the trees across there. And we're trying to highlight the places in Lurgan where there weren't enough trees, where there was a need to plant more. Now, if you're thinking back to those three spheres of Brea and Glacken, so what they're learning about climate change through all of this is very rich, it's very profound. Then what they're doing, the agency that they have is connecting them to like a movement of hundreds of their fellow peers of young people across the town. They're part of something that big, and they're engaging with something that has really powerful and meaningful data. So even if we get out into those two spheres, that story so far is an amazing story to get them involved.
It really is. Really
but there's one more sphere to go.
Of course.
So the final one is how we position the young people as citizens, not just of tomorrow, but citizens of today. So I thought I would use some of the contacts that I had through previous SharedEd programs, because our local council has been very keen to hear some of the things and hear the young people's voice from some of the other things that we've done. So I reached out to them and said, let me tell you about an exciting little project we're doing. I would love the council to get involved. I would love, as we've done before, to take these young people and their story and put them in front of the council so that they can communicate that to the council, and we can start to engage in a process of collaboration and cooperation where you are getting access to a genuinely really powerful data set that doesn't exist. I mean, there's no equivalent data set. There's a primary data, but there's no equivalent secondary data set. So we're giving you access to this. And here's what we want in return. We want you to take the young people's voices, thoughts, concerns seriously, and we want you to respond. And they jumped at the chance with open arms. So there was a meeting we had coming up, I think it was about early November time, where the council officers, environment officers came in and had the first of our meetings with the young people themselves. And it's one of these great experiences, Kit, that you have as a teacher where I facilitated it. I introduced bits and pieces, but I really was giving a platform to the young people. It was their voice. I said to them at the start, this is an opportunity for you in your own words to express what you want to express. And I said, look, also, this is your opportunity to ask for what you want to be done.
Right.
You don't need to wait until you're in your mid-20s to do this. You can do this right now. And look, we'll talk about how you can ask politely and nicely. But even that is an amazing skill development for them. And they were brilliant in that, and how the council responded. And we're looking now at setting this up as a longitudinal study. So we're repeating this every year. So the council has this data going on, and some of the ways in which then we can begin to filter this in and get the young people part of the decision-making processes and the policy making in their own town. Now compare that now, and again, don't please, listener, don't take this out of context, right? Compare that to me simply saying to them, oh, just go and recycle your plastic bottles, would you? Look, that's important. Please, that is important. But we have the opportunity to go so much further beyond through a project like this.
Yes. So it's funny. I had a conversation this morning actually with a head of science at a high school in Norwich, and they want to do something to kind of like raise aspirations to STEM and things like that because they're from a low progression into higher education. And I was like, well, actually, your school hasn't yet done your climate action plan. Here's this for an idea. We can make this whole event about raising aspiration for the kids, but we do it based on enabling them and empowering them to what does climate change action look like in your school, and how does this then link into STEM and to future careers, future prospects. So we've got this whole, so it's very similar approach to you got. So rather than just another typical careers talk or careers workshop, it's actually, I'm going to get kids to go out there and they're going to go map their site using the National Education Nature Park, for example. They're going to do some habitat surveys. They're then going to come back and say, well, what does it need? What kind of expertise do we then? And then I'm going to have climate ambassadors come and talk to that. It doesn't, you know what, when I thought of that on the spot, and I thought to myself, it actually doesn't take too much effort to tweak what you're approaching things. Start local, start with what the kids, their context, and I think that's great. What we'll do, folks, is that there's a video that Alistair wants to share. I mean, we're running out of time with the chat, but what I'll do for the people, well, it'll be for both the visual and audio. If you're watching, I'll cut in some bit where the kids are talking about their story, and you can actually watch them speak. But for the podcast listeners, you'll be able to listen to them anyway. You don't need the visuals, although I always recommend now, Alistair, that they come onto YouTube and they watch the podcast now.
Well, listen, as we're coming towards the end, I'll tell you the final little postscript in all of this. I mean, that in itself would have been a brilliant outcome from it all. But Google got wind of the project we're doing.
Yeah. Loving this.
Gave us this rather exciting invitation. Kit, you will know that I'm never one to miss the opportunity for a cheesy line. So when I came to the kids in the next Wednesday afternoon when our seeing group met and introduced this, I said, normally we go to Google to search for things. Well, this time Google has come searching for us. Yay! Cheesy line. They heard the story. They thought it was a brilliant example of how technology can help in learning about and having agency in climate change, and they invited us to tell something of our story at the BET conference in London in January 2025. If you don't know, BET is the biggest edtech conference in the world. This was the Google experience. It wasn't even just the main stand in the main hall. It was up in the elevated area, and you basically had to book a ticket for it. That's an amazing story in and of itself. I would love to maybe tell you that story sometime of how we did that. But basically, we taught all of the people that were coming along a geography lesson about exactly this, using Google tools like Google Gemini and as Google's AI. for those kinds of things.
I'm just showing a picture of some folks from Google standing in front of your exhibit with your kids in the background in the picture on the screen hugging the trees.
So my role in the whole thing was to pull it all together at the end and tell something of this story in about 2 or 3 minutes. But we had nearly 1,000 educators from all across the world listening to the story. And there was the Northern Irish Protestant Catholic dimension and Protestant Catholics coming together from separate schools, living in separate parts of the town, united in their desire to do something together to tackle the impacts of climate change for the good of the entire community. And I tell you, whenever you're telling that story to people all across the world, it's just so profound and powerful opportunity. So I never thought that we'd get this chance, to make these young people citizens of the world, of their community right now. But really, this is making them citizens of the world. This is a story that's rippling out internationally to give them a chance to share something of that. And for that whole process, we couldn't bring the pupils to London, unfortunately, but we did bring a video camera and gave them about 10 minutes in their own words, not scripted, because this is all the way through being about giving a platform for the young people to express how they feel. And the other thing I love about this group of young people is that they're not all necessarily the naturally upfront young people, the ones that you would stick a camera in front of and they would wing it with no problem. These are the young people that are maybe a little bit quieter. And whenever you give them a chance to tell their story, because of the experience they've had, I was utterly blown away, profoundly moved, because this is the kind of thing that is in our young people. The story you're about to hear is the kind of thing that is waiting to be told, if only we give them a chance to experience climate change education like this.
It's amazing. So, folks, so thank you so much, my good friend Alistair, for sharing that. It's such an important thing. I'm so pleased that I could platform that for you. So, folks, I'll put everything down in the description for you to make sure you can have a look at all this stuff. You can connect with Alistair. You can listen to his previous podcast. And so it's quite naturally, we'll finish off our chat with the people who are most important. Cue the students.
SDG 13 makes me really anxious, and it just feels very doom and gloom about the future. It doesn't feel like there's any hope.
Every time I think about global warming and climate changes, it'd be really overwhelming, and I never really thought about things that I could do as a person in my community to affect this. I was like, well, that's a huge thing, so government must do something about it, not me.
I've always been concerned about the climate, but I just feel like I didn't really have a voice. The most I could do was just really spread awareness and just do small things at home, like recycling and stuff.
Climate change doesn't discriminate. In this country, a lot of people are always commenting on the divide in the two communities, but we must join together to tackle climate change.
I was working on a project with 4 different schools with hundreds of students. We're carrying out a survey across different urban areas on the quality of trees. We're able to use that data to identify how our urban areas are adapting to climate change and the increasing of temperatures that comes with that.
So this has allowed me to develop my skills outside geography, and it really means a lot to me that I can do something for my community and reach out. It's really opened my eyes of what technology can do for geography.
This project just really made me feel like I was really helping our future generations, and as well as helping with climate change, I feel like it was helping with the diversity in Northern Ireland between Catholics and Protestants, especially because we were all working as one team to battle this huge problem.
Although I maybe am not able to do something on a global scale, it felt nice that I knew I could help my community and the people I cared about around me.
After we had got all the data on the GIS map, we contacted people in the ABC Council to discuss what we could do further with the information.
Well, they were very keen to hear what we had to say, and they made it clear that they would like to partnership with us in the future going forward. And this made me feel really like this is something that's really worthwhile. It made me something like my voice is being heard.
The point of SDG 13 is to inspire us to do something to help our communities and environment and work hard on what we can do for our local community. Maybe we can have an impact for the world.